Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of politics and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. It's another guest episode today, and for guest episodes, I always give the disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against a guest's political views or groups they support, but regardless of political views, there is immense value in reevaluating what you believe. None of us have all the answers, and none of us are infallible. Nevertheless, it can be very difficult to be introspective, regardless of whether you are politically left, right, or middle. It's a skill that takes time to develop. So, how can we effectively re examine not only what we believe, but why we believe those things? Here to talk about that is my guest today, Lisa Ekman. Lisa is a farmer, but she used to work as a Democratic lobbyist and advocate for 20 years, particularly in disability advocacy. That work included for 2 Democratic U.S. senators, Democratic appointees at federal agencies, government contractors, and nonprofits. But disenchantment led her away from that and to write a book titled Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites. Now, before you positively or negatively react to all that you just heard, she does have takeaways that left, right, and middle can use for themselves. And I've had liberals, conservatives, and moderates on this show, and I try to let them voice their beliefs while also keeping things level. As always, I encourage you to hear the guests out first and then come to a conclusion. Speaking of which, let's have this discussion about how we all can improve in re-examining our views. Please welcome in Lisa Ekman. Lisa, thank you for coming on today. How are you?
I'm great, Paul. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to come and talk about my experience and how it might help others in improving their critical thinking, examining assumptions they make they don't even know what they do, and uh, improving the political discourse in this country. So thank you so much.
Sure, and thank you for coming on. It's always good to have a guest come on. So, like I said, while I do want to keep most of the discussion from leaning too far toward any particular side or the other, I think it makes sense to use some of your story as an example of what you'll be talking about today. So, how would you describe your political upbringing?
I was raised by very liberal parents. You know, I often describe them as hippies who didn't do drugs. They, um, would have been really. They were very pleased with Jimmy Carter as president, very unpleased with Ronald Reagan. That gives you kind of a sense of where they were coming from. At the same time, and I think this may have been true a lot for Democrats, JFK era Democrats. They were very patriotic, loved their country, loved the Constitution, and they raised me to believe in freedom, liberty, our Constitution, the amendments to it, and treating everyone equally. And they believed in patriotism, they believed in hard work, and they believed in accountability, both at the individual and the governmental level. And so they raised me to be really what I would call a First Amendment absolutist, meaning that, sometimes the hardest part about the First Amendment is accepting speech you don't agree with, and even speech that may be factually incorrect. But what they instilled in me was the idea that my right to speak freely is only as secure as everybody else's, even if I abhor what they have to say or I vehemently disagree with them. Um, you don't want to give anybody else, especially in the government, the ability to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't. I use this as an example to kind of show how they taught me this, and that was that the ACLU, an organization that I used to be a member of and really supported, um, defended the right of the Nazis to march in the 1970s in Skokie, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. I grew up in the Chicago area and have a lot of Jewish residents there in Skokie. And I just couldn't believe it. Why was the ACLU defending them? And my parents used that as an example to teach freedom of speech, obviously for Nazi ideology. And but if they don't get to speak in March and exercise their First Amendment rights, and someone gets to decide that, then you might not either. So I think that gives you kind of a good idea of where my parents were coming from. I always voted Democratic throughout. Once I got the right to vote, I volunteered for Democratic campaigns. And I came to believe, and I think a lot of people on the left did. I mean, I think if you think back to the 60s, um, there was a great deal of anti-government sentiment among the left, especially around the Vietnam War and those kind of things. You saw a lot of protests and "Don't trust the man" and those kind of things. And I think slowly over time, the left came to really believe much more in government and a much bigger government role in our daily lives. And so I advocated for improving government programs, creating new government programs, um, always with the goal of improving the lives of individual citizens. And as you mentioned, often people with disabilities. So that's does that kind of get a good background of where I came from that you were looking for?
Yeah, I think the whole point about the freedom of speech is obviously a great point to make, because there are so many. I think there's a lot of people across the political spectrum that really don't support the freedom of speech as much as they should. And it's not just about in regards to the government, but also in regards to we need to make sure we promote it in our daily lives too, not having these echo chambers, for example. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but it does sound like for a lot of people, or you talk about the phenomenon of the great sorting out from since the 60s, where more and more liberals drifted towards the Democratic Party and away from the Republican Party, and more conservatives drifting away from the Democratic Party towards the Republican Party. Sounds like there may be a little bit of that going on. But actually, let's go ahead to that whole change of belief. So what exactly was the catalyst for you in challenging your beliefs and writing this book? Or was it several different things, a gradual transformation? And how exactly did your beliefs change?
I think the first thing I think there are three things I want to point out here. I think over the time I spent in DC, I moved to DC when I finished my master's degree in social work. I was uh, uh, a nominated for a program that was designed to pull people with graduate level education into federal service. And I moved to DC to do that work. It was the very tail end of the Clinton administration in 1999. And I went directly to work at an agency, the Social Security Administration, working on disability employment policy directly for a Clinton appointee in that agency. Um, and I think I arrived in DC. The way I would describe it is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and believing that I could really make a difference to really change our programs to really help support people and create better opportunities and more independence for people with disabilities. And I think over the first 5 years, maybe I was there, I really saw that that was still the case. And I think during my time, um, I think maybe right around the election of President Obama for his first term, I saw that kind of change, and we started to see. I think everyone who watches politics could attest to this gridlock happening in DC in a way that it never had before. We started to see things like, we have our current government shutdown where we couldn't even agree enough to keep the government open. And I saw sort of the shift away from what I would call good faith conversations about trying to come up with compromise solutions. The thing about compromises is that nobody ever gets everything they want and everybody walks away a little bit unhappy, but you come up with something that both sides think is better than what we had before. And you started to see less and less of those kind of good faith conversations. And you started to see more and more sort of attacks on people based on their beliefs, as opposed to good faith policy discussions. And so I was starting to see less opportunity for our government to positively influence people's lives. And I think that started to kind of make me think about, well, what is my philosophy about government and how does it fit in this new environment? And are we really helping people? through that. The second part of that I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit is a story about my parents' health, because it had a huge impact on the way I looked at our federal agencies and those agencies that are designed to or tasked with keeping us healthy, protecting us, in terms of pharmaceutical drugs and all of the standards and everything else. So um, I lost both of my parents in relatively short order. My dad passed in 2014, and my mom passed in 2016. And I'm going to talk a little bit about her story because that is the part that's really relevant to this, to your question. So my mom, while she was taking care of my dad, who um, had a back issue, had surgery, all these complications, became functionally quadriplegic, and needed a wheelchair, needed help with everything. Um, she developed a very aggressive cancer that was not diagnosed until stage 4. She already had multiple sclerosis, so
Oof.
she was already dealing with a lot of issues. And she got the, you have a very short time to live speech. You should get your affairs in order. And so, knowing what I did for a living, knowing my research skills, I was a competitive debater in high school and college. And so she said, Lisa, I want to live. So please look and tell me, is there anything I can do that will improve my outcome? And so the first thing I told her to do was to not do any research herself, because all it would do was make her depressed and make her sad and make her think she couldn't get better. And believe it or not, that has a huge impact on your outcomes. If you've heard of the placebo effect, it's real, and so is the opposite of it. So, which there is research on now. So I did some research and I found a couple of books that I found to be very persuasive, very well researched, lots of data and evidence using studies, and one was called Beating Cancer with Nutrition, and the other was called Anti Cancer and Your Way of Life. And both of them heavily focused on how what you put into your body affects your health. And the ability to really, through nutrition and detoxification, um, change the outcomes. I mean, they had story after story, anecdotal, of course, but backed by data and evidence, of people with diagnoses like my mom, becoming cancer free. And so we worked to get my mom completely changed her diet, every product she put in her body, on her body, cleaned her home with. We worked, the anti-cancer way of life also really looks at how does stress, how does your psychological state, how you deal with that affects your chances to heal. So we also did things like help her work to decrease her stress reactions, to manage stress in a better way. We did guided meditation, focused breathing, all sorts of things. So my mom, full on went into this. She also had conventional treatment. And so she had surgery, and then she started a round of chemo, which was chemo treatments. And halfway through, they did a bunch of tests, and my mom tested no evidence of cancer after the third chemo treatment. And her doctors were, he was her doctor and her nurse practitioner that she saw were astounded, called it a miracle, couldn't believe it, never seen it before. And she finished that round of chemo and she was completely cancer free for 2 years.
Oh,
Went
wow.
back. Yeah. I mean, amazing, right? So here I have learned all of these things about what is good for your health, how you can affect, change. When you get the worst news ever, you can have a change on that, that is really completely independent of our Western medical system. Is using a lot of things that you would get from, you know, um, Eastern medicine, Chinese medicine, those kind of things. So, because she did a lot of supplementation in those things too. And it was really about giving your body the nutrition it needs and getting rid of all the toxins that it's constantly exposed to. So, after 2 years, they did a scan and found a small growth. And they gave her got her back onto chemo. That first round of chemo caused kidney failure, and she died. And so,
Mm.
um, this really started me to ask a lot of questions about what are our health agencies actually doing, and where are they getting their funding? Where are all these studies coming from? Because I just read these books right? And if you look into um, our treatment of cancer, um, it really hasn't changed that much over 50 years. We're continuing to give people chemo, do surgery, give chemo and maybe radiation, and the outcomes for it are really not very good. And so, what is in my head, what is the FDA doing? Who's funding the FDA? Where is their funding actually coming from? And who's running the FDA? Who's making these decisions? And so, um, I losing my parents like that was the hardest thing I had ever gone through up to that point. And it started to raise a lot of questions for me, like what are we actually doing with it? Are we actually helping people? Or are we just advancing the interests of industry because they have a lot of money and power? So those things started to kind of circle around in my head, but I went back to DC, went back to work, working with those very agencies that I was beginning to question. And so I kind of had to put that into the back recesses of my mind so that I could continue to do my job in good faith, and continue to have that kind of trusting relationship with the agencies that I always already had. Now jump forward to COVID. And really, I think if you talk to a lot of people who maybe have changed their opinions about politics over the last 5 or 6 years. COVID and the response to it had a lot to do with that, and that was very true in my case. And um, so the government response to COVID, first of all, a lot of the things they were recommending just didn't sit right based on all that research and all the knowledge I gained that I was just talking to you about. For my mom's health. So I'll tell, like, this is, I think, the easiest example to give for people to understand. If you recall at the very beginning, they were saying, don't leave your house. You can't go outside. Even if you have a backyard, you're not even supposed to go out in the backyard. Well, one of the best things you can do for your immune system and your health is to get natural sunlight because that's how your body creates natural vitamin D, which is essential for all of the things that keep us healthy and also actually all of the different chemicals our body secretes that keep us happy. Okay. So the worst thing you can do, and you're also, you get to breathe fresh air, you get lots of oxygen, and oxygen rich environments are really hard for most diseases, especially cancer, but also every other disease to grow in. So stay in your house. You can't get fresh air, you can't get sun. And I had to say, like, why are they giving us these recommendations? And it sort of brought back all of these ideas that I had started to question when helping my mom deal with her cancer. So there was that aspect of it, and then there was the 6 foot social distancing. And because I'm a researcher and that was sort of my background, I looked for the data to support it and couldn't find it. And so it became really there. And I think after he was, I think in 2023 or beginning of 2024, Anthony Fauci was testifying before Congress, and he said, yeah, there wasn't really any science. It just kind of appeared. I don't know where it came from. But it was those kind of things that just kind of made me say, well, our government is completely obliterating our rights without even having these conversations and without necessarily having the data and evidence to support it. And then what I started to see happening was overt censorship of people who ask questions or question what the government was saying. And, that really raised alarm bells for me about the First Amendment. You know, um, as a lawyer, I have also a law degree as well as a social work degree. As a lawyer, it's very clear to me that there is no public health exception to our Constitution. In fact, there are no exceptions to the government abridging our freedom of speech. And was terrifying to me to hear my government use the word disinformation and then misinformation and then malinformation. Um, and then realize that the party I had supported my whole life, that I dedicated my life who was the one using those words. And I might have agreed with what they were saying sometimes about it and sometimes not. But again, as we talked about at the at my answer to the first question, um, once you cede the power to the government to tell you what's true, you never get that right. And so I think that is really what started me questioning. So, whose interests is the government really protecting? And are these agencies really doing um, what I would call a positive things for?
Well, while I can't put forth my particular opinion just because I try to keep my personal opinion out as much as possible, I think it is a good point to bring up that there is no such thing as being above questioning. There, you do have to keep, even if you agree with something, you do have to at least pose some questions about why do we believe this thing, and why exactly do we not let any sort of other information come up, and who's saying what, and everything like that. So I think that is a good point to bring up. Now, of course, you can also go the exact opposite direction, and some people can be disingenuous in their questioning, but you got to find that right balance. There is still a reason to find or to question the things that you hear. So that is, I think that is a good point, and one that if people take particular context out, I think most people can agree on that point. So let me just make sure that I hear it straight from you. I don't want to make assumptions based on what you said. Obviously, it's difficult for any of us to challenge our assumptions and beliefs because those are our assumptions and beliefs. We're all human beings, so it can be difficult to be introspective. But did you find it particularly challenging to challenge your assumptions and beliefs? And do you still find it hard to do so?
I It was very, very challenging. And I think it was even, to be honest, harder than losing both my parents that I just talked about. I think it's the hardest thing I've ever had to go. I spent my life being validated for my beliefs. Um, I think what happens with a lot of people these days, I don't think it used to happen as much, but people's entire identity gets wrapped up in their politics, who they are, and it becomes sort of a moral badge to people on both sides. Maybe not in the middle as much, but left, right doesn't matter. It becomes sort of a badge, and all your friends believe the same way that and in my case in particular, I didn't just have that identity in my personal life. That was my also my career and the way that I had decided I wanted to leave an impact on the world. And beyond that, I was an expert in my field. I worked mostly I worked on all sorts of things: healthcare, employment, civil rights for people with disabilities. But I mostly focused on the Social Security disability insurance programs. And so it was sort of I was one of the top experts on the left in that subject matter. So I didn't just go, telling my friends about what I thought. I told the whole country about what I thought about these things. And I was challenging everything I had ever thought to be true and real. And so it was really, really hard. And I think, don't want to skip ahead, into other questions, but I think, one of the things is that um, when you do make big changes like I did and you challenge the assumptions that you have, you often end up losing those friends. And I think we see and having strained relationships with your family. I don't think it should be that way, but it just really is. Things right now are so polarized in our country. And, you see people cutting family members off completely because of who they supported in the election. And so yeah, it was really hard, and I lost uh a, a lot of my friends, and there are family members that I don't have the relationship that I used to um, because of it, and that is really hard. And I also think the other thing that happens when you make as big a change as I did, Paul, is that you question your own sanity too. You know, because when you had such strong beliefs like I did, um, challenging basic assumptions, it can cause you to say, now, am I just like, have I just lost it? Have I just lost my mind? Do I no longer have uh, a grip on what's real? Um, and so, yeah, hardest thing I've ever done. It was, uh, I had to sort of recreate myself because I changed how I believed at such a basic level. And there was a lot of depression. I will be honest, that happened. Um, in addition to kind of not really understanding where I fit in, you know. Like again, I say I was not your average just I go vote and I have these feelings. I was someone whose entire life was centered around those particular beliefs and assumptions. And so it took a lot of work to um, actually get to the point where I am now, get to the point where I wrote the book, and get to the point where I'm able to have these conversations that I think are so very important, because I think there's more about us that unites us if we stop making assumptions, stop judging based on labels, and start actually listening to each other, respectfully, listening to each other, and getting back to a point where we can agree to disagree without it causing us to make moral judgments about the person we disagree.
You, you you spoke to one of my big pet peeves about politics is there's a very self-congratulatory nature of, hey, you think the way I do, you're so good, you're so smart, and getting the pat on the back that you're so intellectual and you've got everything figured out. That's something that I very strongly oppose and has driven me crazy. Now, I mean, I'm not going to say that I've been immune to that or that I haven't done that for people that thought similar to me, because I have done that before. So I have to make sure I'm self aware and I acknowledge that too. But there is just that whole, that not just a group think, but just to like tell people how great they are because they think the same way. I think obviously I strongly believe that we all need to be able to be heard and not be denigrated, but at the same time, I am not about pandering to people, and I think that's a serious issue that we have. But and you also mentioned how this had been your life, and you're I think when you talk about polarized people, the more polarized people tend to be ones who are so ingrained in this stuff, whether they work in politics or at least they're strongly activists. They're not just people who just vote, so it can be even more difficult for them to change their minds, just like you were talking about. So I think there's a lot of people that share your sentiments, not just as Democrats or former Democrats, but Republicans and former Republicans too. So let's take this not just for you, but apply to other people now. So, what do you think are two or three, let's say, of the biggest reasons people find it difficult to re-examine their beliefs, let alone not even just changing them, just even just re-examining and realizing, oh, okay, maybe I don't have everything figured out.
Well, I think the first thing that I'd point to is just sort of people's identities and self worth being tied up in those beliefs. And I think that you're right. It does tend to be the people who are more maybe on the fringes of each party or side. But I also think that um, technology and specifically social media has increased the level of political awareness and attention that people have from the past. It's almost impossible if you go online to escape politics anymore. And people spend way more time looking at a screen than they actually do, sadly, I will say, interacting with people in real life now. And so with that, I think everybody's identity and self-worth gets tied up in it more now than it used to. And so I think that that's one reason why it is so hard, um, to uh, for them to evaluate or even to like question those assumptions and underneath. I think the second thing is, and I actually will have like four reasons here, but the second thing is that many of these assumptions or basic beliefs are really not conscious ones, people. There are things that maybe were instilled in them by their parents, and it subconsciously undergirds the thinking that they have, but it isn't like they're consciously thinking some of these beliefs. And so I think often when we're making judgments about things, they are taking into account many things that are not at the conscious level that we have uh, accumulated over our lifetime. I think the third thing is, something I mentioned about myself, but it's the fear of alienation from your friends and family, of thinking different than the people that are in your life. And again, I have a love-hate relationship with technology, and I think we'll talk about that more a little bit later too. But um, and that is that now, if you had a disagreement about politics with your friend back in the 90s, you might like joke about it and then get a beer, and it's in the past. If you have a disagreement online with someone about politics now, you may get doxxed, you may get canceled, you may get fired, you may get deplatformed, you may, have your life completely destroyed, simply because you may have said something that someone took offense to. And I think that that makes it dangerous in a way that it never was before, to even like question some of the beliefs that you have, um, at least to question them out loud. And and then the final thing I think is that um, there's groupthink, and then there's also confirmation bias that happens. So, you might start to question something, but then you're going to turn to all your trusted news sources and your social media bubble, and they're all going to tell you, nah, you're right. You're totally right. Oh, yeah, we all think that way. And that sort of feeds back into the fear of alienation from friends and family. So that's sort of a self-fulfilling circle of when you start questioning it, you're like, oh my God, what are my friends going to think of this? And then you go and look at what all of the news sources you trust say, and they're going to confirm what you thought in the first place. And so then you're right back where you were. And I think that also gets to that it's hard when you're just sitting there thinking about, well, maybe I should take a look at my own beliefs, of seeing the upside in that. Like, what is the good that's going to come out of that? And there's an awful lot of chance for disruption and sadness and all of those things. So a lot of times it's just easier and more comforting to continue to believe the way that you already believe. So those were the reasons that I really thought of why it's so hard. And I think technology in this instance makes it exponentially more.
Yeah, I think all of those are really good points. I think about the self-worth, it just made me think of Governor Spencer Cox of Utah and then Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico. They had some sort of summit that they were a part of, might have been National Governors Association, but they talked about, to paraphrase, one of the big things was when you talked about your politics, how when people now they lead off almost with the politics, or it's like if you take the list of things that make up who you are and your identity, it used to be like maybe 10 to 15 on the list. Now it's one or two. And that is something that is very concerning to me. Now, of course, for a lot of people, it's expected that it's going to be a huge part of who you are. And that's not necessarily too much of a problem where, like, yeah, it's important to you. But obviously, some people it is the thing that drives them. And just the fact that somebody could think something different is completely anathema. So definitely can that part in particular speaks to me. But of course, all of those are good points, and anybody of any political persuasion can relate to that. So you are a lobbyist. So let's just spend just a little bit of time on that specifically, because there are a lot of assumptions about what lobbying is that I think a lot of people get a little bit wrong. And I mean, sometimes I have my own misconceptions about it because I was never a lobbyist. I have some understanding of how it works, but I never actually worked at it a whole lot myself. So one or two of the biggest misconceptions that people have about lobbying and how it works, and what was the reality that you experienced?
So I think, it's a little, and when I was thinking about this question, it's a little hard to answer. I don't know what people actually think about lobbying, and I'm not sure they think that much about it, to be honest. I think they know that there are lobbyists. I'm not sure they understand the extent to which money plays a part in this. And so I think that may be one of the misconceptions. And I can start by saying that in 2024, $4.5 billion was spent on lobbying members of and so based on your reaction, I think that would be a misconception that people have. The actual scope of that is incredible. Okay. And that is separate from last year, the $20 billion spent on the election. Okay. And I
Yeah.
think that the misconception might be that your vote matters as much as the dollars of lobbyists do. And I think it's sad for me to say that. I think that is also part of what happened during the time when I was doing this work. And part of the reason why those conversations that I said that we used to have, where I thought we could have good faith disagreements, seemed to disappear. And that was also because, in part, the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, which opened up our elections to tons of dark money. And so, I think that the other thing that I think may be helpful for people to understand, that they may have a misconception about is, especially for House members, they're uh, really required to raise a lot of money for the party, for political action committees, and for their own reelection campaign. And so at the end of my career, I administered a small political action for an organization that I worked. And, when I say small, we generally raised a couple $100,000 a year for it that we could, or an election that we could. That may not seem like small to a lot of the people listening to this, but that just gives you an idea of the scope of what lobbying is. So, as a lobbyist, I might take $1,000 and go have lunch with a particular member of Congress that they can use for their election campaign. And, following the rules, there's no quid pro quo. That doesn't mean they're going to pass the legislation I want or include the provision I want in a bill. But what it does do is give me access to that legislator um, that I might otherwise not have if I didn't have that. Okay. And um, the the impact of that, and I will just tell you, relate the story. So a lot of times after an election, if someone has won, they'll have sort of a thank you. And by the way, this is completely nonpartisan. This is both sides. This is everybody in Washington. So I don't want to give the impression that it was only Democrats or only Republicans. It was everybody. Um, they will actually say sort of a little thank you party, a breakfast or a reception for those lobbyists who help fund their campaign, and say thank you. And now here I am, and you helped me get here. And so thank you so much. And then, their door is pretty much going to always be open to you in a way that it isn't for someone who didn't give them that money. And again, that doesn't mean that they're doing anything illegal. It doesn't mean that that lobbyist is automatically going to get what they want, but it does change the relationship with that legislator to that lobbyist in a way that the average voter doesn't have. And I went to one of these thank you breakfasts for a brand new member of Congress. It was her third day in the House. And someone asked a question like, what's your least favorite part so far of being a member of Congress? And she looked around and she was a little bit sheepish to say this, but she said, call time. Well, what is call time? Well, that's when her fundraiser hands her a list of people she needs to call to ask for money. This was her third day in Congress. So the amount of money, that $20 billion I was talking about, and the impact that it has on our legislators to be responsive to us as voters and to be held accountable to us as voters. And again, this applies left, right, and middle. I think would be very shocking to a lot of people who are not familiar with the process. And you can react to that, but I think that is really what I would want to get across. I think, I think as an average voter, most people probably feel that Congress isn't representing us the same way they did when we were, back 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. I think they would be right. And a lot of that has to do with the tremendous growth in lobbying expenditures. So that's where I'll leave that.
I think it's interesting that your initial response was you weren't sure what misconceptions people had. So hey, I guess another assumption of mine to challenge was I thought you would be like, oh well, I have plenty of misconceptions, but you weren't quite sure where other people were coming from. So that was just kind of an interesting response. I think some of the misconception lies in what you were talking about, like that people don't realize that a lot of this is this amount of time that they have to spend fundraising these government officials, these elected officials. It's not necessarily because they want to and they want to be bought by people, but like it's almost like a requirement for their job. So even if they don't really want to spend the time, and I've heard from other people who have been involved in lobbying or even other people who have been in office that a lot of them really hate that part of the job. They do not enjoy that whole like having the glad hand basically, or at least spend as much time as they do because it takes time from doing other things that they are trying to do, whether they're, in Capitol Hill or in the state legislature for the right reasons. And I think another thing is like you mentioned before about how when a lobbyist has dinner with a politician, for example, it's not necessarily, because they're doing that politician is going to do something for them. There is that level of access, but some people don't realize that, like if you painted lobbyist as you call an advocate, tends to have a lot more of a positive connotation amongst people where they say, oh, they're advocating for something. I like to advocate for things, but then you call them a lobbyist, then all of a sudden their opinion tanks. Now, obviously, there are a lot of nefarious lobbyists and there is a lot of underhanded things that go on, but I think some people think that basically everything they do is bad. And every once in a while I hear people say, well, we need to get rid of lobbyists. And it's like, well, you think you want that. You don't want that. Now, there's a lot of things that need to be reformed, but actually getting rid of lobbyists completely is not going to quite have the positive impact you think it will, at least from my understanding. But so shifting gears from the lobbying aspect and now more just for the general overall view about reexamining our beliefs. So on one hand, I think echo chambers and groupthink are arguably they're more prevalent than ever. They're a lot more in your face, but we also have more easy access to info than we used to. So since you've been involved in politics for a long time, do you think it's easier for people to question their beliefs now than they did in the past? And why or why not?
Um, I think it's probably harder. Um, in part for some reasons that we've already talked about. I think it's uh I can only speak really from the left perspective, so I don't intend for listeners to think that I don't think this happens on the right or that it isn't also true. I can only speak though from the perspective that I had. So, um, you know, you are not encouraged, I think, as a member of the left, especially as uh, sort of you get into the more progressive, sort of farther left, to actually listen to people who think differently than you. It's not an encouraged thing. And there is definitely very strong groupthink going on. And if, someone isn't educated, um, you are basically empowered to completely ignore them because only educated, credentialed experts are entitled to have an opinion that anyone should listen to. And it may be the very same on the right. Like I said, I can't speak to that because that's not a community I've never really been a part of. I consider myself pretty independent these days, and I'm not sure I will ever label myself as part of a political party again. But on the left, that sort of limits, how you might challenge your own ideas if you've already automatically said someone who thinks differently is probably not an expert and you shouldn't listen to them. I also think that while you have at your fingertips the ability to access so much information, uh, you're most people again, if they participate in social media, are going to have a social media bubble that is people who think exactly. And it takes more work to sort of go out of your way to hear what people who don't um, agree with you think. Uh, and it's very easy to get that sort of confirmation bias that I was talking about before, you know, um, simply uh, only trusting certain news sources that may be tend to favor, the political side that you identify with. And so while on the one hand it could be so much easier, um, I think if people took advantage of the unprecedented access to information that we have, um, but I don't think that in reality it plays out that way for most people. Um, and I also think that um, the search algorithms on certain platforms um, and the algorithms on social media also impact your ability to access information in a way that may also.
I think another problem that doesn't necessarily really get lampshaded is, I mean, yes, the whole, even though we have this information at our fingertips, people aren't necessarily equipped to research that information. But another side effect of all this increasing research that we have on psychology, for example, is yes, it helps us to really better address how to talk to people. But I think also a lot of nefarious actors have been able to exploit that information too and more effectively box people into echo chambers and groupthink, like social media companies, for example, with their algorithms, how they've engineered it to really just keep people in a never ending cycle of anger and just sticking with their echo chambers. And I think that's, I don't know what the solution is to keep people from exploiting that. I don't know if you necessarily can, but beyond just trying to help equip people better to try to withstand that kind of onslaught, for lack of a better term. I think I'd be inclined to agree that it's probably more difficult now, even though in a way probably should be easier than ever because of all the information that you have. But it's one thing to have that information, be readily available. It's another to teach people to how to find that information. And then it's another thing to get them to want to find that information, kind of like what we're talking about at the beginning with, what prevents people from wanting to re-examine their beliefs. And obviously we'll get a little bit more into that in these next few questions. So even though your book is more directly critical of Democrats, or at least progressives, I want to make sure to highlight takeaways that anyone watching this episode can use. And you've already made that point too. So what are one or two general views or attitudes, not even necessarily specific views, but just general attitudes for each of the groups, the left, the right, and the middle, that you would encourage each group to challenge?
So I'm gonna have them for the left and the right, and then sort of adapt those a little bit for the middle, because I think people in the middle usually tend to lean one direction or the other. They have a little bit. So, but I'll start with the left. And the first thing that I would suggest that they uh, think about and challenge is that experts are always right. I think there is the default opinion that if someone has gone to school and gotten credentialed, they're not gonna be wrong, and they're not gonna give you wrong information. And I think that um, that isn't the way science is supposed to work, right? I mean, the scientific method is all about challenging someone who thinks they know the answer. That's the basis of it. And, um, you know, I think with that we can identify, and, I won't go into specifics, but if we wanted to have a whole hour conversation, Paul, about the times the experts were wrong, I could give them to you. But I think on the left, there is this automatic assumption that if an expert said it, you can't question it. It's almost a religious belief in experts. Okay. The second thing that I would say is people on the left should question, or should challenge themselves to really ask themselves, is government always the right answer? And especially more government, especially at the federal level. You know, have we the farther away from the actual voter you get, the harder it is can be to hold those elected individuals accountable as a voter. So when we think about, on the left, um, you know, expanding programs, more federal expansion, and those kind of things, um, challenge yourself. Is government always the answer? Um, and I think lastly, I would say for people on the left, I've heard this a lot, and I still do. Sort of the idea that everyone on the right is uneducated and therefore should not be listened. And that that just really isn't true. In my experience, especially since I've sort of become an independent and listened to a lot of people, um, there are a lot of educated people who call themselves conservatives, libertarians, those kind of things. And um, you know, uh, along with that, challenging the assumption that if you don't have a formal education beyond, say 12th grade, that somehow that means you aren't intelligent. And somehow that means that you can't make rational decisions for yourself. So that would be what I would say to people on the left. Now, the people on the right, they're very similar. I'll be honest, but sort of inverse almost. I would say, you hear a lot of things of people on the right calling people on the left stupid, and so it's sort of the inverse of that last one. But I don't want to use terminology. I don't like calling people names. But there are many names that people on the right might call someone who is on the left. Um, that would imply that if you are a liberal, you must be dumb. And so I would challenge them to challenge that assumption. Think about what could it be? What could be some of the reasons besides them not being intelligent that they might have this difference of it? And I would challenge them to challenge the assumption that government programs are never good. There's sort of this assumption that I'm not saying everyone on the right is a libertarian and doesn't want any government, but in general, it's sort of the assumption no government program is good or worse. And I think there's a lot more nuance. I do think that it makes sense for us to ask questions. If we've had this program for 50 years, are we getting good outcomes? Is it actually helping people? Are we getting, like a good return on our investment in this program? Those are different questions than to just start from the assumption of, hey, government's already done. We should never have government programs. And so it's sort of like I said, the kind of the opposites, but I think that those are things that are at the base of a lot of what the disagreements are between, the people with different political views, and those would be the ones that I would start with. And I think the other thing is that, as we've talked about, it's gotten so polarized, that there's sort of this assumption that uh, people on the other side they're not moral because of the beliefs that they hold. And I think I would challenge everybody to start thinking about um, the fact that policy disagreements, uh, two people could have the same goal. Let's improve um, the economic situation for children when they become adults. And very different ways of thinking about how you achieve that without making a moral judgment about the fact that this person wants the government and this person doesn't, to help make that help achieve that outcome. So I guess basically that one kind of comes down to stop assuming people who think differently than you are bad, and just like try to come at any question you're having with an open mind, as opposed to prejudging someone based on a label that you've given them often, and they might not even give that to themselves, but you've given them, and then assuming that what you think goes along with that label is at the base of that person's reasoning, rationale, or moral goodness, in this situation. So that would be what I would say. And for the middle, obviously, it applies to everybody. Those kind of apply to everybody. And I think, since I have sort of changed how I believe, I've seen these kind of assumptions coming from every aspect, no matter where people find themselves, sort of left, right, middle, in between. And so I think if we could just start with challenging some of these assumptions, and especially about the moral goodness of the people with whom we're having a disagreement, we could have a lot better discussions and maybe get back to a point where we can talk about compromises that actually help people, and actually move us towards what some of our shared goals might be, even if we disagree about the best way.
Yeah, and it's hard to get that everybody out of that mindset of, well, I am superior. I've talked about it in a couple previous episodes of the whole moralized attitudes where people, they feel like they would be doing their moral code and themselves a disservice if they didn't fight tooth and nail for those supposed morally superior set of beliefs. And so it's not even about winning, or it's not, even if they were, the idea of like giving up on any of that's supposedly what compromise is, that they would be immoral if they did that. And yeah, that's definitely one of the things to really break people out of. And it's okay to believe that something is morally superior, but to assume that somebody does not have morals because they don't think the same way is not really a moral way to think yourself, to really impose on people. If you really think if it's really that important to you that to push those morals, then I think trying to force people into a box, you're not trying to bring people, quote unquote, into the light. So you're still really just doing your set of moral beliefs a disservice, in my opinion. There's so many assumptions that everybody across the political spectrum really needs to not even necessarily change, but at least re-examine and be willing to re-examine. And that kind of goes into this next question. So critical thinking is unfortunately not taught well in school, and that is carried on into adulthood as well. And we don't really teach it well for adults either. And that's regardless of level of intelligence or interest. Smart people can also be not always think critically all the time. So what are 2 or 3, whether they're from the book specifically or from just your general observations, what are 2 or 3 critical thinking tips you have that anybody can use?
Sure, and I do talk about these in the book, but I think I think it is about having a free mind and thinking critically about any issue that comes in front of you. And the first thing I would say is don't accept anything at face value. Question everything. One thing that happens in our education system, in our employment, in corporations, is that questioning the people in charge is not encouraged. It is actually very discouraged. So when you're in school, you can ask questions to better understand the subject matter. But if you start questioning your teacher and saying teacher's wrong, you're gonna get you're not gonna get rewarded for that kind of, there's all sorts of ways you might get punished, actually. Um, and the same thing at your job, if you a lot of times, you're a troublemaker or you're trying to upset the apple cart as opposed to I'm trying to understand why we're actually doing what we're doing. So you don't have to do it publicly, but when something gets thrown at you and it's a new idea, or even just when you're, trying to digest the news of the day, like, does it make sense? Does is what they're saying make sense? Does this line up with what I know to be true about this topic? Um, why would they be saying it? Is there a reason that they have that they might want to put this forward that may not actually be true? So that would be really the first thing. And the corollary to that, in politics especially, but I think in general as well, is that I would encourage people to follow the money. And what that means is when you're asked to believe something, ask yourself who paid for this. You know, so for example, back when I was a kid, pharmaceutical companies could not advertise on TV. And now, if you turn on mainstream news, almost every ad is a pharmaceutical. So ask yourself, do you think that the mainstream media, who depends almost entirely on pharmaceutical advertising for their income, is reporting fairly on pharmaceuticals? Now, that doesn't mean they aren't, Paul. But what it means is that you should be asking yourself that question. And you should be asking yourself, well, where did the money come from? Who benefits from it? And then where does it go? So when you start tracing the money, then you can kind of think critically about, well, maybe they're saying that because if they don't say that, they'll lose this money. Or maybe they're saying that because they were paid to say that. And it doesn't automatically mean that something is wrong because somebody paid for it. But it makes sense to understand the money trail in order to understand, is is what I'm being told accurate and true, or is there some slant to it because of um, who paid for it, or they're making money for it from it, or uh, where the money is going after what I'm looking at. So that would be the second one. And then the final one, and we've sort of already alluded to this, but I would say look for and listen to people that you disagree with an open mind. So get yourself out of your echo chamber. You know, any idea that's true and right stands up to scrutiny. And this is the whole thing about censorship to me, too. If you have the facts and you have the data and you have the evidence to support your position, you should welcome debate. You should welcome questioning. You should welcome challenges to your ideas. And so get out of your echo chamber, even if it's someone that your friends might make fun of you for listening to, listen to them. And then you can say, I've listened to this person and here's why I disagree and here's why they're wrong. I think what you will find when you do that is you will start thinking about things in a different way, and it may help you challenge some of the assumptions that we've been taught. Now, that doesn't mean this person's going to be right, and it doesn't mean that you're wrong. What it means is that you are examining the ideas and the assumptions you hold and the assumptions that you make in order to hold those ideas, and it will make you infinitely better at defending your own position if you understand what someone who disagrees with you thinks, why they think it, and then you can then respond to that. Um, and sometimes it might cause you to change your mind on something, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think we it's really really hard to admit you're wrong about something. It really is. And the opening line to the prologue on my book is admitting you're wrong is never easy. Admitting you're wrong about everything is next to impossible. But when, to me, that is the sign of a truly free mind and someone who also has freed themselves from the the needing to conform and fit in and being afraid of what people think of you because of your beliefs. So, you may do all the things I just said and may not change one idea or one assumption that you have, but then you can at least say to yourself, you know what? I know that idea I have is right because I looked at the other side. I examined the evidence that the the person who is supposed to be the smartest on the other side about this. And, it didn't persuade me and it made me aware of the assumptions that I was making. And when I went and looked, and my assumptions are right. Or you may come away from it and say, you know what, I was wrong about this. And to me, the person who can admit they're wrong is the person who's growing, who's learning, and who really has, not that I really does have moral ground to stand on because they aren't just, they are attempting to make the best decision that they can based on all the available evidence and not just that which confirms.
Yeah, and admitting you're wrong is definitely difficult. Fortunately, I've never been wrong about anything. No, I'm kidding. But the point about the following the money, I think a good way to also put that is the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Who is saying what this information? What is the information? Where did you see the information? When did you get the information? Was it near an election time, for example? Why would they tell you that? And how did they tell you that? I think those are good ways to also put forth what you were just talking about with the following the money. So now, obviously, it can still be difficult for people to bring themselves to use those tips, but they are still things that people can do. So, more specifically about your book, what are 1 to 2 misconceptions of your book, whether you've actually heard them or you want to preempt potential misconceptions that you want to clear up?
So I think one of them I kind of already mentioned. I'm not a Republican, um, and I think if you saw the title, you'd think, oh, that person's probably a Republican. Well, I'm not. I believe that, or that someone might believe I think the Republican Party is better than the Democratic Party, or Republicans are better than Democrats. I don't. I actually believe that the parties themselves are way too powerful. And that is something that, I don't have an easy answer for it, because, I don't want to see us become like a lot of European countries where you have 23 parties and there's a majority government and I don't know that that's any better. But part of when we were talking about lobbying, what happens is that you really do have to toe the party line because the party is going to give you a lot of money, right? They're going to help you with your reelection. You also get to determine what committee you sit on and whether you ever move up and become a chairman or a ranking member or all of those things. So, I think that our system has, and some of the founding fathers really warned against parties becoming too powerful. It's one of the things that could really corrupt our republic, and I think unfortunately it kind of has. And so uh, I think that our I think that's a misconception people could have reading the title. Oh, this is just another conservative Republican who, thinks Democrats are bad. I don't. And I specifically think that what we're really faced is a challenge of a system in which the parties have become too powerful. And what we have is an establishment sort of that has all this power and that fights really, really hard to keep. 95% of incumbents get reelected. 95%. Yet the approval of Congress is in, I think, like the low teens now or something like that. So people seem to have this idea that Congress is terrible, but I'm going to reelect my person. And a lot of that has to do with the money that is funneled into these election campaigns by the parties. Um, and so, I think also that again, I couldn't write a deprogramming everybody politically because I only came from one side. And I think that there are people that are just as programmed on the right as there are on the left. It may be different, but I think again that what we all need to focus on is how we're the same and how we can reclaim our power as we are given it in the Constitution, as we the people, away from the establishment. And in part, that starts from having respectful conversations like we're having today. And doing some of the things that we were talking about in terms of changing our assumptions about people we disagree with, and critically thinking about all of our beliefs all the time. The more you can re-examine them, the better. And again, if you have looked at the other side's arguments, quote unquote, other side, and all their data and evidence, and come away thinking that you're still right, then I think you've really, you've done a good service in critically thinking for yourself. And you'll be able to be more persuasive to people in order for us to all come to better agreement. So I think that, again, the misconception would be that I'm attacking Democrats and I'm a Republican and that's just not.
Yeah, I suspected that was going to be at least a misconception that you brought, but obviously I didn't want to make that assumption. Where this whole thing is about not making assumptions or at least challenging your assumptions. So I wanted to make sure that that was made clear. Because I, like you said, the book title can make it sound like to somebody like, oh yeah, okay, they just went to the other side, kind of thing. So thank you for clarifying that. So we are running a little low on time, but we're pretty much at the end of this. Before we get to the final question, the fun question, any final thoughts you want to share about your book or critical thinking or re-examining your personal beliefs?
I think, I would say my book would be a good place to start in re-examining your beliefs, regardless of which side of the aisle or in the middle that you think yourself think about yourself. Um, as someone said to me as I was examining my own beliefs, I have a website. You can send me an email through it if you buy the book and you read it and you think I'm completely wrong. Tell me. Tell me why. Prove me wrong. Show me the evidence and data that says I'm wrong. I am open to conversations with anyone. Um, and I promise with any conversation that I'm going to be respectful about our disagreements. And I will come armed with data and evidence to the conversation. And I think every conversation that I have makes me a little bit better in my critical thinking and my ability to espouse my position. So my book is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and I do have a website that is deprogrammingdemocrats.com. And through that website, anyone can get in touch with me and You know, I I believe that we're at a critical juncture where our country um has to do some healing. You know, a house divided cannot stand, at least not in the long run. And as we become more tribal and less civil, and um, and we start and start viewing each other less and less as fellow humans with which we share a lot of innate uh, characteristics and things in common, it makes me really worried for the future of our republic. And so I think you know, that's part of why I wrote the book. That's part of why I'm on this podcast with you talking about this, because I think we have to reclaim the ability to have these civil conversations, view each other as human beings who want to do the right thing, that we just don't agree with about everything. And so that is, really why.
Yeah, and definitely agree with this being a critical juncture. Now, I obviously try not to fearmonger. Obviously, you don't want to do that, but it is a very concerning time we do live in, and it is something that we do need to fix and fix soon, or this is going to get even worse. And at some point, our republic cannot stand, just like you said. So, really appreciate you making that last point. So let's now shift a little bit though from the more apprehensive doom and gloom, for lack of a better term, and let's go to a little bit more of a fun question. So for those of you who are new to the podcast, I like to end guest interviews with a random question of the day. It's a fun, non-political question that tries to make things more well-rounded, get a different side of the guests for that episode. And so for you, Lisa, today's random question of the day is: if you had the power to unilaterally enact one or two policies, which are fairly non controversial and not politically charged, they're relatively trivial, so they're not really that important in the grand scheme of things, what would they be and why? And if you want a couple of ideas, I've already got a couple that are locked and loaded.
Not political and fun, huh? Um, so I would love to see, and I don't, some people might see this as political because it would be government telling you you're supposed to do something. So I just phrase it that way. But um, a mandatory 30 minutes of uh, disconnection time when you get off your devices and you go outside and you see the sun and you touch the earth and you reconnect to nature. Um, I think, um, and again, like I said, some people would say, well, you can't mandate that. But I do think our society and our mental health would be much better if people got off their machines sometimes and stepped outside.
Looks like Lisa dropped out. So, well, hopefully she'll be able to come back on. But for me, my answer is, so I would make it so that you get heavy fines for not parking between lines when you don't need multiple spaces. So you're going to a parking lot and people just decide to not park in between lines like they're supposed to, and they are completely inconsiderate of other people, and putting chewed gum anywhere that is not a trash can. And I use those two specifically because back in grad school, when I parked one day to go to some sort of function for the political science department at the University of Florida, parking there sucks. Parking also at my other alma mater, University of South Florida, also sucks. I suspect that parking at universities is just awful in general. But there was somebody who did a poor job parking, and I could barely get out of my car, and I was getting a little annoyed, and I verbally said, really? Really? He clearly didn't like that, because when I came back to the car and I tried to open the door, that same person put chewed gum on the inside of the handle. Even though they did a horrible job parking, that is totally their fault. They decided to do that, and they were already gone, the coward. He was definitely somebody that got me a little bit salty, and I was none too pleased with that. But yeah, heavy fines for both of those things. And then people just spitting their gum out on the sidewalk in general. Like, what is wrong with you? This is supposed to be a proper society, but whatever. Those are a couple of things that drive me crazy. So those would be the things I would unilaterally enact. Not to, obviously not actually politically charged. I wouldn't really do that. You obviously couldn't actually enact those policies anyways on your own, but it's more to be sort of a fun exercise. But unfortunately, since Lisa dropped out, I won't be able to ask her, or I'll ask her afterwards what other links she wants to share, and I'll put those in the show notes. But really want to thank Lisa for her time being on here. And that's going to wrap things up today for us on today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. So please check out my show notes and her show notes, my show notes, my Facebook, Paul Rader, author and speaker, my LinkedIn, my medium.com profile, my website, paulrader.org, my email, paulraderwrites, as in writing, at gmail.com, and my 5-day educational email course about how we can more effectively depolarize American politics. So that is going to end it for today's episode. So as always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.